All right, so starting the presentation on Rabbinic Polemics. Does anybody know what a polemic is? Anybody? Alex?
It's like the opposite of apologetic. So instead of defense, it's like offense.
That's pretty true. Yeah. It's usually in relation to religions. So a polemic means that I'm like making an argument against another religion. So today we are not arguing against Judaism. We're actually looking at what rabbis historically have had to say against Christian viewpoints. So I've listed 6 of many arguments against Christian positions. We're only going to do the 2 ones in green, but at the end of each section, I'll ask you guys if you have any questions about what I said, and then once we get to the end of the presentation, you can ask questions about anything else. So if you have some questions, try to remember them because it'll make the presentation more interesting if you have some questions. But number 1, that's the primary argument they make, is that Jesus didn't fulfill messianic prophecies. Number 2, Christians are wrong about messianic prophecies. That sounds very similar, but it's not quite, because in number 1, rabbis will present prophecies and say, oh, Jesus didn't fulfill this. Whereas number 2 is mostly about prophecies that Christians say are messianic prophecies, but the rabbis say, no, they're not. They're just about somebody else. So we're going to learn some words here, too. The 3 T's of Judaism. I'm pretty sure there's probably more than 3 words that start with T in Hebrew, but we're only going to look at these 3. So you got the Tanakh. That means the same thing as the Protestant Old Testament. So that's just what that means. I'll be using that word in the presentation instead of like the Old Testament usually, but it means the same thing if you're Protestant. If you're Catholic, you have a few too many books. But Talmud. Talmud is a much more complicated book. Christians and Jews view the whole Old Testament as inspired. So it's infallible. There's nothing that's incorrect in there. A lot of it's allegorical, but there's nothing incorrect. The Talmud is actually mostly a fallible document from a Jewish perspective. There's basically the story goes, a long time ago on Mount Sinai, Moses received many rules from Hashem, from God, and he told the Jews to write down most of the rules, but also he retained technically thousands of rules for himself, and he passed them down orally. Why this is, I don't know. Is that mentioned in the Tanakh? No, it's not. It's not there. In fact, it's one of the chapters of Exodus says that they wrote down all of the rules that God told them, so it's not a very good argument, but it's what they believe. They call that the Mishnah. That's part of the Talmud, and that's the part that contains all of these infallible rules from God, just like the Bible. But the majority of the Talmud is the Gemara, which is all of these things. It's got historical material, biblical commentaries, philosophy, theology, wisdom, literature, fart jokes. It's got a lot of stuff in there. I recommend checking out the Talmud at some point. It's a really fun document. And then we have Targum. This is kind of a dirty word to the rabbis nowadays. So like it says here, originally oral, Aramaic version of the Tanakh with words added for clarification. Targums are often called a paraphrase of the Old Testament, but that's not quite right. Usually with paraphrasing, it means I take the original sentence and I alter quite a lot of the words in it, but retain the same meaning. A Targum is a little bit different. It actually adds words into the text of the original Bible. And so what's going on there is that a rabbi at a synagogue will read one verse from the Tanakh, and then they will reread it, but with words added to clarify its meaning. That's like how a sermon would go basically in a Targum format. So just for the sake of clarification, for example, if the Tanakh said the international student, it's not very clear. There's probably a lot of international students at UNC Chapel Hill. Who's it talking about? So a rabbi delivering like a Targum version of it would say the international graduate student from Somalia studying finance. So it still has the original words, the international and student, but it has a lot of clarifying material there so you know exactly what it's talking about. And that's really the story with the Old Testament, is that there's a lot of prophecies that could go one way or another. You can kind of debate the interpretation, and the Targum is supposed to clarify that. However, Targums were not actually supposed to be written down, and that became a later development. And so originally they were just oral. And the reason is pretty obvious because, if you start writing down what is essentially an alteration of the Bible, it looks like you're trying to alter the Bible, which is genuinely not what the rabbis were trying to do. They're not trying to change the Bible. But ultimately, Targums started being written down towards the end of the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. You don't need to retain all that for now, but we're going to, Targums are a big part of this presentation. One particular one called Targum Jonathan. All right, so we're going to get into point number 1. Jesus, according to the rabbis, didn't fulfill messianic prophecies. So the big thing with the rabbis nowadays is the way they present the issue of the Messiah is that he is a conquering Messiah who ushers in world peace, super happy, fun time forever and ever. That's what we get about the Messiah. And that's it. It's a very one-dimensional Messiah. He shows up, he arises from the people of Israel and conquers all the forces of evil, and then he ushers in that is the apocalypse. And then there's the post-apocalyptic age where, good times. That's it. That's their whole conception of the Messiah. Now, is that historical? No, that's not really how Jewish people viewed the Messiah. But that's how they view it. And this is what's called the Messiah ben David archetype. So the Messiah ben David means Messiah son of David, or really Messiah descendant of King David. And he is the conqueror, because that's what King David was in the Old Testament. King David, like 1st and 2nd Samuel and some other books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, invades the future land of Israel and kind of kicks some butt and kicks a bunch of people out of Israel, and sort of his goal was to kick idolatry out of the land of Israel. So that's why this messianic prototype or archetype is called Messiah ben David, the conquering Messiah. Now, here's the argument, because Jesus has not yet brought in an era of world peace, so it's not the apocalypse and the post-apocalyptic age yet, therefore he is not the Messiah. Now, that's like a half-truth, right? Prophecies at the time that they're made haven't come true yet. If I say tomorrow I'm going to have a ham sandwich for lunch, well, that prophecy hasn't come true yet because it's not tomorrow and I haven't eaten a ham sandwich. But that doesn't really prove that it won't happen. By necessity, a prophecy must first be made and then come true later. And so this doesn't really eliminate Jesus from the contention of being the Messiah. It just means it hasn't come true yet. But then their logic, they take it to its unreasonable end, which is that because the prophecy hasn't been fulfilled, therefore it will never be fulfilled, and I can disbelieve on this basis. That doesn't really make sense, but that's kind of how they see it. And I guess I should step back and say from a Jewish perspective, because they think the whole concept of Messiah, there's no suffering and dying Messiah, nothing like that. He's just a conqueror. Well, it appears that Jesus hasn't fulfilled any messianic prophecies, basically, other than like being born in Bethlehem or something like that. And lots of people are born in Bethlehem, so that's not a very strong argument in and of itself. Because they see this as such a very narrow and one-dimensional Messiah, if you become convinced of this way of looking at messianic prophecies, well, then Jesus clearly doesn't look like the Messiah. And that's why Jewish people are like extremely unconvinced, especially Orthodox Jews. So if I had to sum up in one sentence how Jews view the Messiah in such a way as is exclusive of the Christian view, it's that there is only one Messiah who fulfills all messianic prophecies in one temporal lifetime, meaning that there's no death and resurrection. They don't allow for that, and they don't allow for more than one Messiah. So now, can I get you to read all of the gray text?
You've given me the fun part.
Yeah,
okay. All right. Christian commentators applying this chapter to Jesus are compelled to divide his career into what is called his first and second comings. Commentators attempt to solve the problems inherent in their explanation of this chapter by claiming that Jesus appeared the first time to provide a means of salvation for mankind, whereas in the second coming, he will come to judge and rule the world. This, however, is simply not in accord with Isaiah's prophetic message.
Thank you. So this is one of those half-truths. This is an exegesis of Isaiah 11. Now, Isaiah 11, it's true, only has one Messiah, and he's a conquering Messiah. He doesn't die. He's certainly not resurrected. And so this is basically true in relation to Isaiah 11. But this is not a commentary on the rest of the Bible. It does say that this, however, is simply not in accord with Isaiah's prophetic message. Well, that's not really true at all. As you know, there's multiple prophecies in Isaiah that would point to a Messiah that does something other than conquer. Isaiah 53 is the most obvious one. We will talk about that. But like I said, it's just an example. There's many half-truths in the rabbis' arguments, and you'll see that as we go along. So this is just a repetition. One Messiah, one temporal lifetime. However, this statement is contradicted by the Talmudic, so stuff from the Talmud, and Midrashic interpretation of a Messiah ben David and a Messiah ben Yosef, or Messiah ben Joseph. So, I have another one. This one's got some harder pronunciations, but don't worry. All right, so from the Talmud, Tractate Sukkah from the Babylonian Talmud. So this is from 450 AD. So now we're getting into the Messiah ben Yosef theory, which is something that rabbis today are literally not going to tell you about. But I just want to point out that the historical interpretation is that there's two messiahs. So this does not prove Christian views, by the way. And that's not what I'm trying to do right now. We'll get into that later. But the historical viewpoint of the Messiah, as you're going to see, is very strongly focused on the idea of two messiahs. There's two. One is the Messiah ben David, the conqueror that we talked about. The other is the Messiah ben Yosef, who is a warrior, or Joseph. He's a warrior. He fights the forces of evil during the apocalypse, but he dies. And after he dies, the Messiah ben David comes and kind of cleans house with the bad people. So now we're going to look at some literature that talks about the Messiah ben Yosef. So, sorry, I confused you. So from the Talmud, one of the books in there is called Tractate Sukkah. From the Babylonian Talmud, there's more than one Talmud. We're not going to worry about that. And this was written sometime around 450 AD. So can you read this?
I'll try. Apropos the eulogy at the end of days, the Gemara asks, for what is the nature of this eulogy? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Dosa and the rabbis disagree concerning this matter. One said that this eulogy is for the Messiah ben Yosef, who was killed in the war of Gog from the land of Magog, prior to the ultimate redemption with the coming of the Messiah ben David. And one said that this eulogy is for the evil inclination that was killed.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a very dense paragraph here. There's a lot of things going on. And just for the record, this is an exegesis of Zechariah 12. Don't worry about that because we're not trying to interpret the Bible, just that's what they're talking about. And so, also one more thing. So Rabbi Dosa, the guy mentioned here, was alive during the end of the Second Temple period, so that's the 1st century AD. So he lived through the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. He lived through that. So he lived through a very difficult time in Jewish history. But most importantly, that means that the Talmud is saying that, yeah, this content here was written in 450 AD, but it actually dates back to the time of Jesus, basically. Rabbi Dosa was, I guess, born probably during Jesus' lifetime, became a rabbi probably after Jesus' death. And so what that would mean is that, according to this, the Messiah ben Yosef concept goes back at least to the 1st century AD, probably prior to that. So this is Nachmanides. He's from the 12th century AD. So this is Midrash. This is a medieval rabbi. We're not going to read this whole thing. If you want to go look at the presentation later, you can look over it. But what this is saying basically is that in Exodus 17 and 18, Moses and Joshua, the two prophets together, fight against the Amalekites here and kill them. And so this rabbi, Nachmanides, believed that in the future, that in the past, Moses and Joshua created kind of like an archetype of two prophets who together fight against the forces of evil and prevail, and that this archetype will be again fulfilled by Elijah and Mashiach, that means Messiah, ben Yosef. And we see that the translator of Nachmanides' writing, he commented that, I'll just read this here myself. So, the Messiah ben Yosef, or Mashiach ben Yosef, as he says, will first accomplish the ingathering of the exiles, so the dispersed Jewish people will come back to Jerusalem. They will fight their wars. Then Mashiach ben David will come. So again, they're affirming that there's two Messiahs, Messiah ben Yosef, Messiah ben David. I have some other sources here too, but this is just to show you that we have a source going back to the 1st century AD. Now this is from the 12th century AD. So this idea persisted over 1,100 years at least, and we can keep going. Here's another medieval rabbi, 1300 AD at this time. Same thing, Exodus 17 and 18, and he says that there will be a Moshiach ben Yosef. Same thing. And then one more source, just for the sake of argument. This is from the early industrial era. Here's a rabbi yet again talking about a Messiah who is a Ben Yosef. There's many more sources on this topic, but the purpose of this is kind of repetitious, right? I'm just saying the same thing over and over again. The point is to show that this is a very popular idea with rabbis. It goes back to at least the 1st century AD, and I can literally show you a 21st century rabbi still promoting this viewpoint. So the idea that there's only one Messiah, Messiah ben David, conqueror, he doesn't die, no resurrection, well, that's a serious issue because it's almost like the predominant viewpoint, or at least 50% of rabbis throughout Jewish history have been very convinced that there's two Messiahs. Now, we're Christians. We don't believe in two Messiahs, so this is not a validation of our viewpoint. But it serves to illustrate that as Jewish apologetics will tell you, and most Jewish people that I've interacted with, mostly online, seem very convinced that there's only one Messiah, and they're very resistant to the idea of a Messiah ben Yosef. Every single source that I've shown you is from rabbis. So this is not like a historical critical scholar or something. This is all from rabbinic materials, and there's far more. So the idea that there's only one Messiah and there is no suffering and dying Messiah is kind of antithetical to the modern rabbinic position, but rabbis throughout history have been pretty clearly convinced that there's two Messiahs. So, so this is just the conclusions here. So the prominent viewpoint today is that there's one Messiah, fulfills all messianic prophecies in one temporal lifetime. But the way that I've characterized this is that this is not really a genuine Jewish belief, but it's more of an anti-Christianity polemic. And I put Christianity because it's not an anti-Christian polemic, right? You know, we're not here to pit Christians and Jews against each other, and that's not what it is. It's not a personal attack. They're just saying, oh, this is our interpretation of the Bible that just so happens to contradict what Christians believe. And that's the thing. Because as soon as you start talking about the Messiah ben Yosef, who fights the forces of evil and dies, well, now you have to start looking at the messianic prophecies that would make you think that that cause you to come to the conclusion there's a Messiah ben Yosef. And that's a real issue because rabbis don't want you looking at that. Rabbis don't want you looking at Isaiah 53. They don't want you to look at that because if you read it from verse 1 to verse 12, it sounds exactly like Jesus. It really does. And so it's more expedient to just not talk about Isaiah 53, say that's not a messianic prophecy, and the Messiah can't die or anything like that. Like I said, the historical Jewish viewpoint that there's two Messiahs is not a Christian viewpoint, and it does not prove our point at all because we think there's one Messiah. But the reason why this is useful is to show that they believe in a suffering and a dying Messiah. And now we can get into that. So now we're getting into Isaiah 52 to 53. I'll give a short introduction. So in neither the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or the New Testament, in neither case were there originally chapters. Chapters are not a part of the original manuscripts. And so it's not really a frequent issue, but sometimes the true beginning of a chapter is actually in like the second half of a previous chapter. Isaiah 53 is one of those. There is a my servant who is mentioned at the end of Isaiah 52, who then continues to be mentioned as the main character of Isaiah 53. Now, Rabbi Tuvia Singer, who is the guy in the guy with pointing his finger at the beginning of the presentation.
I like that guy.
You like him?
I don't know. I'm just never mind. Just a joke. Just a joke.
Dr. Brown, who we'll have in January, he's a debated singer. He knows him personally.
Okay, well that's cool. Yeah, I like Dr. Michael Brown. Yeah. Yeah, no, they are well acquainted, I think. So Tuvia Singer is going to, right here, introduce, I'm going to let his words speak for himself. So could you go and read that?
Yeah, sure. The well-worn claim frequently advanced by Christian apologists who argue that the noted Jewish commentator Rashi was the first to identify the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 with the nation of Israel is inaccurate and misleading. In fact, Origen, a prominent and influential church father, conceded in the year 248 CE, 8 centuries before Rashi was born, that the consensus among the Jews in his time was that Isaiah 53 bore reference to the whole Jewish people regarded as one individual, and as being in a state of dispersion and suffering, in order that the many proselytes might be gained on account of the dispersion of the Jews among numerous heathen nations.
All right, let's stop there. Thank you. All right, so this is the claim that the rabbis make today. This is like almost universally what they will tell you, and they tell their constituents as well, which is that the servant, singular, in Isaiah 53 actually refers to every individual member of the nation of Israel. So all of the 12 tribes, it refers to them as individuals. We're not really going to be doing much exegesis in this presentation because this is a long presentation. We're about halfway through maybe, but that's a whole nother thing. It's not a very good interpretation, to be honest, but that is what they claim. And so they claim that Christians are just coming out of left field with some totally other interpretation of Isaiah 53 that doesn't make sense. Now, Tuvia Singer is doing the best he can here with the history, and good for him. The history just doesn't really support his claim. So Origen, by the way, he is a Christian church father. That's what Tuvia Singer meant. This quote here is pretty darn good at dating the viewpoint. Origen refers to, so this was written by Origen. His own personal notes say that he debated with some rabbis about Isaiah 53 in 248 CE, or they put CE instead of AD, of course. But what Origen says here shows us that it's a post-Second Temple viewpoint. Like he says, Origen thinks that this interpretation of Isaiah 53 came about in response to the state of dispersion and suffering in order that many proselytes might be gained on account of the dispersion of the Jews among numerous heathen nations. Every ethnic group over time tends to spread out, and most of the ethnic group stays wherever they're from, but individuals go elsewhere. Origen's definitely not referring to the fact that sometimes Jewish people, maybe you're a tradesman, you go west and you end up living in some Greek territory. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, the expulsion of Jews from most of Judea, and on top of that, Jewish people became much less interested in living near Jerusalem anyways, because the whole temple sacrifice model was no longer possible without a temple. That's what he's referring to. That's why he says twice he talked about a dispersion, but also suffering. I wouldn't say that some Jewish person who, maybe he married a Syrian woman and goes north or whatever. I wouldn't say that's suffering. That doesn't really make any sense. But dispersion and suffering, well, that would clearly relate to the destruction of the Second Temple. So while useful for showing that this interpretation of Isaiah 53, that it's the whole nation of Israel, it is useful for showing that it clearly goes 800 years before Rashi. That's true. Origen's quote at the same time shows you that this is a post-Second Temple interpretation. And so the Christian task is to show that our viewpoint was at least prominent or present in the Second Temple period, before the destruction of the Second Temple, which is, excluding the New Testament, harder than you might think to prove. Because basically the implication of most rabbis and the direct statement of some rabbis, the more brave ones, is that Christians are just making stuff up. And not us today, but the first Christians. Basically, they're implying that Christians were just making up new interpretations of verses to try to kind of like piecemeal together some sort of philosophy from the Old Testament. And that's not true. We'll talk about the evidence for Isaiah 53 and our interpretation in a minute. But first, this is kind of a useful note. This is another quote from Tuvia Singer. Can you read this?
The broad consensus among Jewish and even some Christian commentators that the servant in Isaiah 52 to 53 refers to the nation of Israel is understandable. Isaiah 53, which is the fourth of four renowned servant songs, is umbilically connected to its preceding chapters. The servant in each of the three previous servant songs is plainly and repeatedly identified as the nation of Israel.
So this is an interesting claim. Pretty much every rabbi believes this, and even Bart Ehrman, I can't remember which one of his books I was reading. I think it's Heaven and Hell, but he said this too. This is nonsense. It actually doesn't make any sense. There's no connection between the so-called servant songs. They're all like distributed across like the second half of Isaiah, but they're not like right next to each other. There's no language that clearly makes them all part of the same like type of poetry or something like that. But most importantly is what we're going to see on the next slide. Isaiah 53 talks about my servant. No further details are given. I mean, there's more content in Isaiah 53, but Isaiah 53 is obviously a controversial chapter because it's not particularly clear who my servant is. Oh, and I should point out that, as it says, the servant in each of the three previous servant songs is plainly and repeatedly identified as the nation of Israel. True. It says, my servant Israel, or my servant Jacob. Jacob, my servant, something like that. And that's true. And that's exactly the problem with this whole theory about Isaiah 53, is that in the three servant songs, which I would concede are all servant songs, that's true, it says who the servant is. It says, my servant Israel, Jacob, my servant. Isaiah 53 doesn't say that, so it actually doesn't fit the pattern at all. That's the whole problem. But on top of that, I could say something like, well, in these three servant songs, it says, my servant Israel. So I can just kind of infer that whenever Isaiah is talking about a servant, it must be the nation of Israel, right? That sounds marginally reasonable, but then you got to look at the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 20 verse 3 says, my servant Isaiah. Okay, so now we have a different servant. And it hath come to pass in that day that I have called to my servant, to Eliakim son of Hilkiah. Well, that's a completely different servant. And I have covered over the city to save it for mine own sake and for the sake of David, my servant. So that kind of blows up the whole idea that we can just assume my servant means Israel. We're looking just at the book of Isaiah, and we have 3 other servants. So you can't just assume that the my servant in Isaiah 53 is the whole nation of Israel. So now we can get into the historical evidence for our viewpoint, the positive case for our viewpoint. So Maimonides, who, as I mentioned before, is pretty much the most prominent rabbi according to Orthodox Jews, he says in his epistle to Yemen, similarly, Isaiah referring to the arrival of the Messiah implies that neither his father nor mother nor his kith nor kin will be known, quote, for he will shoot up right forth as a sapling and as a root out of the dry ground, 53 verse 2. Anybody want to guess which chapter of which book it's referring to? It's Isaiah 53. That's a quote from Isaiah 53. And so Maimonides very clearly identifies the servant as the Messiah. When you talk to Jews, pretty much Maimonides is the person you should be bringing up, because what we're doing here, we're going to go further and further back into history, is not really how they look at things. It's a bit more similar to talking to Catholics, where it's more about what is the consensus, what does Tony Fauci say? What does Anthony Fauci say about Isaiah 53? That's kind of the approach. It's what do the experts say, not really what does the history and the evidence say. And so this is probably the most useful piece of evidence I can give you, is Maimonides says it's a messianic prophecy. And it's also very helpful I'm not going to read this, but basically in the exact same document, Maimonides, on the same page of the same document, says some awfully nasty things about Jesus. Obviously, he's not trying to help the Christian case, to say the least. All right, so now we can look at the actual Hebrew. So this is Isaiah 52. We talked about how this whole section about the servant begins in Isaiah 52. Indeed, my servant Israel? No, it doesn't say that. My servant shall prosper, be exalted, and raised to great heights. So I highlighted the Hebrew word here because when we look at the Targum, you'll see on the next page, no English translation. It's all Hebrew. So we're gonna use our photographic memories and just look at these 4. These are 4 letters. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this one looks kind of like a peace sign with some the thumb hanging out here. Excuse me. This one looks like a backwards C, or maybe the opening of a cave. This one just looks like an upside down L. Then we got our apostrophe. This matters. Trust me. Try to remember this. You got our peace sign with your thumb over here. You got your backwards C, upside down L, apostrophe. That means servant, okay? Next page. What do we see in the Hebrew? Got my peace sign with my thumb hanging out, my backwards C, my upside down L, and my apostrophe. That means servant, okay? So in the, what's that, Elijah?
Can we go back? Are all the vowel pointings the same?
No.
A little dot.
Yeah, there's a little dot on the.
They're not quite the same though. Cause see the upside down L here?
The 7.
Yeah, it's got a little dot there.
That's important.
Only sometimes, because sometimes we're actually going to talk about this too. Sometimes the dots can, like usually when it's under the letter, that usually means pronunciation, which has nothing to do with the meaning. So I don't know all of the meanings, but sometimes dots to the side actually indicate punctuation. But that's a literal entire discipline, is differentiating the different styles of punctuation. Don't worry about it. It does not modify the meaning of the word, though. You're not going to find a Jewish person who reads this in Targum Jonathan and says, oh, that's not servant. That's what it means. This means servant. But now we have a second word right here, also highlighted. So what does that mean? Well, this means Messiah. But let's try and just remember what it looks like. We got our sort of like an upside down U with a little hangnail there. All right, we got our W, very easy. Apostrophe, we have our Roman arch, and then the Aleph, which is kind of like a squiggly X. Can you remember that? Whatever this is, upside down U with a little hangnail, W, apostrophe, Roman arch, and a squiggly X. What does that mean? Here's 2 different Jewish dictionaries. Up here we got our upside down U with the hangnail, W, apostrophe, Roman arch, squiggly X. That means Messiah. There's a lot of citations here, so it makes it hard to read this dictionary, but it means the Messiah, the expected King Messiah. That's what that word means. This is from the Jastrow dictionary from a rabbi, Marcus Jastrow. Here's a second dictionary. Same thing. Same letters right there. It means the Messiah. Klein dictionary by Ezra Klein. I don't know if he's a rabbi, but he's definitely Jewish with a name like that. So that means...
I can read it too. It says Messiah.
Yeah. So that means my servant Messiah. So we talked about how the Targum it's originally like a sermon format. It's an oral format. The rabbis, first they read the exact line, come in. Read the exact text of a particular verse from the Tanakh, and then they reread it, but with words added. That's what a Targum is. And so here, they've added the word Messiah after the word servant. And so this is Isaiah 52. And so what are we learning here is that whoever wrote Targum Jonathan, and really this content comes from a century or so before he wrote it, well, he thought that my servant in Isaiah 52 and 53 is the Messiah. That's what that means. That's the word that they actually said is my servant Messiah. So Targum Jonathan was written probably before 50 AD, so first century, probably shortly after Jesus' death. It's composed over a long time. But the content of a Targum is originally oral, and it's based on oral tradition. So this is not from 50 AD. It was written then, but the content comes from anywhere from the first century BC back theoretically as far as 350 BC. So when we compare this, which is exactly as I just told you, to what Rabbi Tuvia Singer is showing us, which is that this viewpoint dates back to, at the very earliest, 71 AD. And that's being extremely generous. This probably dates back to around Origen's time, the idea that the nation of Israel is the servant. Well, the Christian interpretation is over 200 years older than the idea that the nation of Israel is the servant. And keep in mind that this is from Rabbi Tuvia Singer spends his free time trying to refute Christians. So if they had a better and earlier source than Origen, he would provide it. And it's pretty bad for his viewpoint that he has to use a Christian source. This must have been a very novel viewpoint during Origen's lifetime because nobody wrote it down. No Jewish person had even written it down until after Origen's time period. This is the very earliest source that we have for the idea that the nation of Israel is the suffering servant, and the Christian viewpoint goes back to before Jesus was born. So by far, Christians have a much older interpretation of Isaiah 53. Does that mean it's true? Well, that's kind of a separate question, but obviously I think it's true, and I think all of you do too. So just the conclusions here. The Christian interpretation was written in the Targum Jonathan in the 1st century AD and is sourced from prior oral tradition. And as we talked about before, Maimonides confirms the Christian interpretation. The modern Jewish interpretation dates back to after the destruction of the Second Temple, and so the Christian interpretation is much, much older. So the next one, Isaiah 9, verse 6. In the Jewish Bible, it's verse 5. Matt, can you read what it says there?
For a child has been born to us, a son has been given, and authority has settled on his shoulders. He has been named the mighty God, the eternal Father, a peaceable ruler.
Yeah, so this is a Jewish translation. In most Christian Bibles, it says like the Prince of Peace. That doesn't really matter for the sake of our discussion here. Now here, like it says, we have two major interpretations by rabbis of who is the subject, like who is this child who will be born. So we have Maimonides, we talked about him before, he's from the 11th century AD, medieval rabbi, tractate, whatever that is, I don't know how to pronounce it. That's from the Babylonian Talmud. And then Targum Jonathan, which is our bestiest of friends for this presentation, which would be the oldest source here. However, we have three different sources saying that it's actually King Hezekiah. Anybody remember King Hezekiah? He's one of the more famous kings because he was actually good. There's some bad kings in the Old Testament, but Hezekiah is really good. He's it's been a long time since he was alive, but he's an object of great respect. So he was a good person, and we can see why they would want to attribute this to Hezekiah. Rashi, who was, I think, 150 years before Maimonides, he is usually held up to be roughly on par with Maimonides in terms of like how influential and how highly Jewish people value his opinions. So we got him. We have Midrash Ruth Rabbah. That, I don't know what exact century, but that's a medieval work. And then Tractate Sanhedrin. That's in the Babylonian Talmud. That dates back to 450 AD, but the content of it is definitely older. So we've got some pretty old sources actually going back to saying that Hezekiah is the subject of Isaiah 9, verse 6. Now, Targum Jonathan is still clearly the oldest, so Christians are still winning. But I actually think that when it comes to this verse, it really comes down to exegesis, since the history more strongly supports either interpretation. The biggest problem with this is that it can't possibly apply to Hezekiah. He was a good king, but the word that's translated as the mighty God, it's actually just one word, Elohim. You've probably all heard this one before. It's used over 1,000 times in the Hebrew Old Testament to refer to Yahweh. That's who that is. It's a plural term, though. And so the problem is, the only character in the Old Testament that is referred to as Elohim is Yahweh. Now, there are plural. You want to disagree with that? Did I forget something?
Oh, no, you just finished it with the rest of the sentence.
Okay.
There are plural, right.
Yeah,
references.
because it's a plural word, it is applied to multiple individuals at once. That's true. There's a psalm, I think, where it's sort of like God is talking to false gods. He's talking like false idols and condemning them. He calls them Elohim. Well, that makes sense because there's more than one of them. But Hezekiah is one person, and he's also not God. So why on earth the word Elohim would apply to him, I have no idea. And this is why we see Maimonides, who is, generally speaking, look, I'm not a big fan of him. He was very anti-Christian and anti-Jesus. But he is probably one of the most reasonable rabbis I've read. That's why he doesn't think it's Hezekiah. And again, he's not confirming that this is Jesus by any means. Maimonides is not on our side. But obviously, multiple people, including the very oldest source here, don't think it was Hezekiah, and that doesn't make sense. You can even look at the eternal Father. That's two words in Hebrew. One means eternal or everlasting, and the other one means father. I didn't even bother to look up whether Hezekiah has kids because I don't care. He was not an eternal father. He might have been a father, but every person that has kids who is male is a father, and none of them are eternal fathers unless otherwise explained. Hezekiah is not stated to be a guy who lives eternally. He's not like the eternal father of Israel. At no point does eternal father correspond to Hezekiah. And this is why you will see that many Jewish sources don't think it was him. I truly couldn't explain to you why these old, like Tractate Sanhedrin is really old. I have no idea why they thought it was Hezekiah, but you can see the rabbis are basically split on this topic, but about half of them think it's the Messiah, and that's what we think too. We think the mighty God, the eternal Father, the Prince of Peace, the wonderful counselor, and so on. We think that's Jesus. We think it's a messianic prophecy, and we have multiple Jewish sources, including the very oldest one, agree with us. Matt, can you read this again?
Sure. Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel.
All right. Looking at this phrase, the young woman, does anybody know what this says in Christian Bibles? The virgin. That's right. It says the virgin. Now, we are actually not going to talk about that because it's a totally unproductive argument with the rabbis. Don't waste your time arguing with them about that. Because Mary was a young woman. It doesn't matter if she was I mean, it matters to us that she was a virgin, but it doesn't matter if this actually says virgin. If you've ever looked into this, you know that this is a very old and very heated discussion between rabbis and Christians. I have no idea why. What we're actually going to talk about is Emmanuel. There's a little apostrophe here because there is a pause or an emphasis on the El in this name. So, but before we talk about like what the Hebrew says, on this verse, nobody apparently among the rabbis knows who Emmanuel is. We have some unnamed rabbis, I think from Rashi talks about other rabbis who say it's Hezekiah. Rashi says it's not, these other rabbis are wrong, it's not Hezekiah. Rashi doesn't say who it is, he just says it's not Hezekiah. So he doesn't even say who it is. Ibn Ezra, another medieval rabbi, says it's the son of Isaiah, and a very late addition to the Babylonian Talmud, Sopherim, from 750 AD, says it's a divine name, meaning that's, in some way, God. I want to qualify this by saying the Babylonian Talmud, just like the Bible, has additions over time. So it was compiled in 450 AD, but there were later additions. And so this tractate was added 300 years later. So it's a pretty late, it's not late from our perspective. This is still during late antiquity, before the medieval era, but it is not part of the original Babylonian Talmud, to say the least. So I'm going to do you a favor and read this myself. So these are a bunch of quotes. By the way, I should preface this by saying these are a bunch of quotes here from the Bible in uses of the word El. So in I will tell El of the decree, the word El is sacred, but the sages maintain that it is secular. So whoever wrote this paragraph in Sopherim disagrees with other Jewish sages. I don't even know what Bible verse this refers to, but apparently there's a disagreement over whether this is a usage of El that corresponds to Hashem, Yahweh, or if it's just a secular usage of the word. Here's another one. In El, God, in Zion, the first is secular and the second is sacred. So right here, I think this word God, I think that's Elohim in the Hebrew, I'm not sure. So they're saying that this first one, El, is secular, and this second one, God, is sacred. This is kind of boring, I know, but this is what I went through to make this presentation. In quotes, when he should go El, God, in judgment, unquote, the first is secular and the second, Elohim, is sacred. So El, secular, God, this is Elohim in Hebrew, is sacred. In the case of Emmanuel and Emmanuel, very fine distinction there. The first is secular, so Emmanuel is secular, and the second, Emmanuel, is sacred. The first must not be divided into two words since it forms a single name, but the second is divided. All right, that's the relevant piece of information here. We have the name Emmanuel and the name Emmanuel that is actually, according to the rabbis, divided into two words. Now I will show you what that looks like in Hebrew. This is very important. So this is Emmanuel. This is exactly what we just read, but in Hebrew. This is Emmanuel with no division. And this is Emmanuel. There's a space here. This is actually a later addition. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see here, this is exactly what we just read here, right? And this is the Hebrew. So this is the division that they're talking about, is a space between Emmanuel and El. So this is the same thing, this is from the Bible, Isaiah 7:14. We see, this is at the very bottom, the end of the verse, from the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex is the big dog. That's the codex off of which any Jewish Bible today, they're going to copy paste their Hebrew from the Aleppo Codex. So this is basically the most important codex that Jews have for the purpose of reproducing the Bible and having the right Hebrew. Well, what it has here is Emmanuel and El, and it even has a little dot here. This indicates punctuation. So that indicates that there's definitely a pause between Emmanuel and El. We'll talk about that, the punctuation stuff, in a minute. This is from Codex Babylonicus Petropolitanus, which is, I think, 100 or 200 years before the Codex, Aleppo Codex. And this is the word we're looking for, Emmanuel and El. Now, there's not really much of a space there. You can sit around and argue that, well, with this letter Vav, it's like a straight line with a hook. Well, when there's no space, the letters overlap. Like down here, this character, Bet, is kind of going under the Vav here, right? You can see that? But that is not particularly important. What's important here is that, see this dot? This is what Elijah was alluding to earlier. This indicates a pause. This is a punctuation mark, basically, in Babylonian notation. So, Emmanuel, punctuation, El. This is an excerpt from, about Babylonian punctuation. I got the footnote up there, Matt. The complex form found in the famous Codex of the Prophets dating to 916 and preserved in the Library of St. Petersburg, as well as in certain fragments in the same collection. The vowel points are the same in the simple system, except when the Vav, that letter we're talking about, straight with a hook at the top, is written, I don't even know how to pronounce these words, is represented by a point within it, e.g., this is like, I know that's very low quality, but this is a Vav with a little dot there, and this is a Vav with no dot. So it's supposed to be written with a dot to indicate punctuation. This is from a style guide on like how Babylonian punctuation works. So if there's a dot, that's a punctuation mark. It indicates some sort of pause. But now we have the Dead Sea Scroll. This is the Dead Sea Scroll. The next slide is zooming in on it a little bit. This is Isaiah 7:14 from the Great Isaiah Scroll. There's actually multiple fragments of various scrolls of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, the only one that has Isaiah 7, verse 14 on it is the Great Isaiah Scroll, the biggest one. So we can zoom in a little bit. I'm just showing you this for the sake of transparency because it's very interesting. So this is Emmanuel. This is that squiggly X, the Aleph. And right here is where there should be a space and or a punctuation mark. Now this is, I wish I could get higher quality and really look at it, but it doesn't look like there's a punctuation mark there, and it doesn't look like there's a space there either. So, and we can sit around and guess about why that might be. Don't worry, we'll look at one more source. It could be because, if I go back, this is the last line getting down to the bottom left corner of this page. So it's entirely possible that the scribe who did this would just squish together where there was a space to try to fit this into the very bottom left corner of the page. Maybe. I wasn't there over 2,000 years ago, so I have no idea what that guy was doing. Maybe he's right. Maybe there is no space and no punctuation. I don't know. I wasn't there. But if you look at the Dead Sea Scroll, it doesn't actually appear that it's Emmanuel. It's just Emmanuel. But then we can go to our friend Targum Jonathan, who is from roughly the same time period as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Got a little punctuation mark there. So it does appear, basically the outlier here is the Dead Sea Scroll. It does appear that this is Emmanuel, not Emmanuel. And so according to the rabbis of the later part of the Babylonian Talmud, this would be a sacred name. Now, what does this mean for Christians? Not much. I mean, I don't really care about this. I have no idea whether these rabbis are right. I mean, did they just make that up? Probably. But it is curious that basically with the exception of one, all of the manuscripts seem to show that there is a punctuation, there's a pause between Emmanuel and El. And according to at least one rabbi who contributed to the Babylonian Talmud, that would make this Emmanuel a sacred name. And that means, when rabbis say that, that means it is God. Like that usage of the word is in reference to God himself. In case you're wondering why Emmanuel matters, is because El, of course, is a word in Hebrew that means God. And that's why the division between Emmanuel and El, if there is a division, is significant, because that emphasizes the God part of God is with you, something like that. I think that's the logic. All right, that's the end of the presentation.